My guest is Shira Hecht. She's an independent scholar living in Boston. Welcome to the show, Shira.
Thank you.
Shira, you've done some work on this. How do you see Israel in relationship to the diaspora at the present time? It's become very central to the whole diaspora, as it once wasn't.
Well, I'll introduce first where I'm coming from, which is two different positions. One is as an American Jew in my own middle age. So I grew up with, Israel from the perspective of standing in the United States as a Jewish woman.
Is it different from Chicago than from Boston?
Oh, vastly different.
Really?
No, it's probably not that different. And my other perspective is as a sociologist of religion, which probably flows much from my Jewish background. And that's an interesting community, and religion is something that actually exists, even whether you're a believer or not. So the question about how Israel relates to the diaspora, I did research, and there's a very, very common strand of almost, the bottom line way to put it is that there's a very intense relationship feeling between Jews in the United States and I assume in other diaspora areas in terms of how they relate to Israel. And it's very fundamental to, I think, the way religion gives you the possibility of growing as a human being. So when I think about Israel, and what I do prefer to still think about it as diaspora, some people have wanted to get rid of the word diaspora and talk about global Jewish communities. I would pause before we did that because I would want to really understand what work diaspora, that concept and that relationship is doing for us before we throw it away, because I think it's very powerful in Judaism. I know it's a resource for Jews outside of Israel, that concept and that relationship. My huge question is how are Israeli Jews and Israelis going to relate to what I consider to be a really powerful dynamic in Judaism?
Well, I'll save that question first,
okay.
to the Israelis, because there's Israelis in the diaspora, Israelis in Israel.
Fair enough.
If you're talking about doing work on religion, if you looked at 1910, the Jewish community, 100 years ago, Israel doesn't exist. Zionism barely exists.
Right.
In 100 years, you get a radical change in the community and a radical change in the religion, where suddenly a state and a country is the centrality. It's not even a marginal part or a part that's been introduced. It becomes the center of everything.
It's also a massive change, what you're describing, from a conceptual Israel to a real Israel.
Right.
And this conference that I attended just now is making me come to a conclusion that Jews outside of Israel have always felt a little bit in a one-down position. Well, you're running a state there, you're running a country, your lives are on the line, we can't speak to certain questions. And Israel's always had sort of the upper hand in some ways in that respect. And what I'm beginning to conclude is that Jews outside of Israel also, by the virtue of not running a state, not having their lives on the line, also have something profound to contribute, especially in the larger context of Judaism. And the question to me is, how is that leverage also going to be entered into the conversation so that, yeah, what you're describing is that Israel's a very real place now. It exists so much in our consciousness, and I'm very intrigued with how those Jews in Israel and those Jews outside of Israel each have a valid, extremely valid, grounded place that they're living, and spiritual goals and human development needs. And how can they each be valued in a conversation that's in a common framework?
Well, the common framework doesn't exist, I don't think.
No, I don't think it does right now.
Because I don't think it's possible, because if you say, as you said, that you live in the diaspora and you don't have the responsibility for a state, you don't have the responsibility for ruling over minorities, you don't have the responsibility for going to war, you don't have any of those ethical issues, except as an American you might, because Americans like to go to war, as opposed to Canadians.
Except on a bad day,
I had to get that in.
Except that there's such a rich cultural and intellectual tradition in Judaism that has come out of not running a country. That again, I'm sort of like, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater yet. There's so much fruitful conversation and development that's occurred as a result of, I do believe we have been a people without a state. And there's something that I'm trying to, I guess, get in touch with, which is now we are a people with a state. But somehow we're still also a people without a state. There are thousands of years in which we developed some very rich and powerful ideas as a people without a state. To throw that away and not have that be a resource, because that was the framework that used to exist, that led to Israel's development. As useful as the UN was in establishing Israel, it would not have done it without the Jewish people saying that's where we would like to have our symbolic and real location.
Okay, let me talk about another dimension of that. That's very interesting, because I think you're right, and it may be underestimated, that role of that value that Jews as a diaspora community without a state.
And I do say this, by the way, also as a non-Orthodox Jew. I'm speaking to Judaism in a non-denominational, non-right-wing way, I would say.
Well, let's take the other dimension, though, of Israelis in the diaspora, because they're an increasing proportion of the diaspora. I don't know what percentage they are in Boston. They're certainly very high in New York. They're very high in Toronto. It's about 25%. What do you see as, because there's they have the relationship to Israel, very different than the other diaspora community. They have a relationship to other diaspora Jews. So it gets a little triangulated and confusing. As
their numbers increase, and it happens in the last few months, I've fallen into an Israeli setting a little bit. I was going to Israeli dancing in the Boston area, and it happens that many of the people there were Israeli women. And I'm just a sociologist. I'm observing, and I'm noticing that your question is a great one, because it feels like they're creating, the Israelis who are not in Israel and are here, are creating yet another component of Judaism, of the Jewish community. And they are going to, I hate to use the word compete with American Jews, that's my perspective, for how to define, why do we do these rituals? Why are we in this room doing Israeli dancing? That's what I felt at that moment. I thought, well, I know why I'm here doing I sort of know why I'm here doing Israeli dancing. I was raised with it. It's my way of relating to Israel. It's my way of expressing myself. I'm guessing they have a different reason for being there in a certain way. Maybe it's the same reason. And so I'm actually very intrigued. I think it's a great question you're asking, and it's something I'm just beginning to think about as a new sub-community that's very important in the Jewish community.
And I think the diaspora institutions will have to change radically, because the synagogue has a central role in one and not in the other. Yeah. But you now have another community that arises, which is the anti-Israel diaspora Jewish community, which is relatively new, because there were Jews who weren't affiliated or not involved with Israel, but this is an activist anti-Israel Jewish community.
Well, I'll try and step back from that for a second. I've been thinking about this too. I think that we will get back what we put out there. And if the process in the Jewish community is one of venom and attacking and labeling and black and white thinking, that's pretty much what we'll end up with. And when you say the anti-Israel Jewish community, I would just hope for a process that we bring to every part of our lives, that we bring to our offices at work, and that we hopefully bring to our children and to our families and to our friendships, which avoids labeling and avoids black and white thinking and avoids ad hominem attacks, in order to find out what we're all going to bring to the conversation. So that's my peaceful resolution, is that hopefully the process will reflect the outcome. So let's think about the process of how we're talking to each other.
It may be, Sherry, that you're an American at heart, which is
optimistic. I am American at heart.
which is optimistic, and
yes.
Eventually we'll all come together and we'll be one family. But we'll know.
That's what we Americans are there for.
We can't predict that. But
yeah.
Anyway, I want to thank you for coming on the show, Sherry. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for this opportunity.
Okay. Israel is renowned for its spectacular innovations in many fields. Next week, we begin a series on the medical research scientists at IMRIC, the Institute for Medical Research, Israel, Canada, at Hebrew University's Hadassah Medical School. Canada raises funds and engages in research collaboration. Join us for our show on innovation and law. We will explore politics and war as well as science. Join us next week. I do hope you enjoyed tonight's show. We aspire to provide high quality as well as entertaining and objective programming that will inform, enlighten, and enrich the public's knowledge of Israel and the Jewish world. Comments are always welcome. So our memberships, please join. I hope you'll tune in next week. I'm Howard Edelman. Good night until then.